Thank you so much for listening today. My name is Sara Rahman. I'm a research manager at the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. And today I'm going to be talking to you about this cost-benefit analysis of the merit program. As Jackie mentioned, it's a collaboration that we did with colleagues at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, but also New South Wales Health, that we've done over a few years. So very grateful to their assistance. Also would like to thank my co-author who I think was hoping to dial in today, but she might not be, Nadia Theore, who led a lot of the work on the costing side. So just want to acknowledge that. So today, my presentation really is in 4 parts. First, I'll give a little bit of background into this cost-benefit analysis and also, I guess, the broader context of why we're looking at merit. I'll talk a little bit about I'll go into how we actually quantified the benefits of the merit program. And then I'll talk about how we estimated how much it costs to deliver the merit program compared to a typical local court pathway. And then I'll just wrap up with some conclusions and possible implications for policy and how merit's delivered in New South Wales. So just to give some background about our study and about merit, for those of you who might be less familiar, merit is a alcohol and drug treatment program in New South Wales Local Court. It operates quite widely. It's available in 62 courts across New South Wales, and a small number of those also deliver alcohol treatment. Most of them deliver drug-only treatment. It's quite a large program. Approximately 4,000 people are referred to merit every year, and about 60% are accepted onto the program. The eligibility criteria for the program are just that a person needs to be an adult on bail, they need to have a treatable drug problem, and they must not have been committed an indictable sexual offense, or not being charged with, rather. And the objectives of the program, at least in the stated objectives, there's 3, which are to improve the health and well-being outcomes of participants, to prevent and minimize harms from alcohol and other drug use, but also to address those sort of criminogenic factors relating to drug and alcohol use, which might be contributing to their offending. And while diversion from imprisonment isn't a stated aim of the program, it does allow people who are engaged in the program to demonstrate their prospects for rehabilitation, which magistrates can then consider in sentencing. So there could also be some sentencing benefits associated with merit. All right, if we think about how merit works, I guess you can divide it into 4 components. Someone who's referred to merit is typically subject to a very cursory eligibility screen by a magistrate, and then a more extensive eligibility and suitability screen by the merit team, which is a New South Wales Health team of practitioners. If they are found to be eligible and suitable, then their matter is deferred for 12 weeks. In this 12-week, they are subject to treatment, which in most cases is drug and alcohol counseling delivered by the merit team, but can also consist of outpatient treatment, so residential rehabilitation and withdrawal management, and it also may consist of other referrals to other services. And I guess another element is that there's some judicial oversight. For example, at the 6-week mark, a person typically has a check-in with the magistrate, and at the end of the process, then a report is delivered to the magistrate about their participation in the program, which, as I mentioned earlier, can then be considered in sentencing. So I guess our question really is whether providing drug treatment to offenders can pay for itself. And there's certainly a precedent for that from the literature. I want to draw your attention to 2 studies in particular. I think the first is that in the US, the Washington State Institute of Public Policy puts together and compiles cost-benefit analyses based on evaluations of many evaluations of specific initiatives. They did one on adult drug courts, and they find, even though they didn't even consider any health benefits, they were just looking at reoffending and sentencing, they find that the savings from accruing to taxpayers, but also other people, just from these reductions in custody and reoffending outweigh the cost of these programs by almost 3 to 1. However, of course, drug courts are very different to merit, and especially in the US. Many of them are more intensive. They can vary in length. They typically include more closer supervision, urinalysis, system of sanctions or penalties for non-compliance. Whereas merit is a lot shorter and doesn't include many of those intensive elements. But merit itself has been subjected to several evaluations over the years. There's one in particular which looks at the impact of participation on reoffending, which the Bureau undertook in 2009. And really, it's quite and it did find that there was a reduction in reoffending from people participating in merit. However, I think this study, it used a strategy which relied upon the propensity of a legal legal representation to refer someone to merit, but it could be flawed in the sense that someone may be more likely to have legal representation if they're more likely to go to prison. So there's just a number of I guess weaknesses with this study, so which kind of warrant another examination of the effects of merit, but also that previously we've never been able to look at the health outcomes associated with participation in merit. And so that's kind of the motivation for our study for through this work that we've been doing with New South Wales Health and NDART, we've had access to a greater range of data about both health and justice than in previous studies. So we are better able to identify who else in the local court who was not referred to merit might have been eligible based on their criminal justice and health history. Okay, so our cost-benefit analysis, we look at the period 2012 to 2017, and essentially it asks a few questions. First, we are interested in what the benefits of merit are, if any, in terms of reduced justice contact, reduced usage of health services, and reduced mortality in the 2-year term referral. We're also interested in the costs of merit. So as I mentioned earlier, how much more does it cost compared to a typical local court pathway? And then putting those two together, figuring out whether the benefits of merit outweigh its costs. And we do this in 2019 dollars. So just for those who are interested in the details. So turning now to the benefits of merit and how we figured it out or estimated it. We used, as I mentioned earlier, we have access to quite a large linked data set. So the sample comprises all the eligible adults in the New South Wales Local Court from 2012 to 2017, which we obtained from the BOCSAR reoffending database. Linking this to the merit information management system, we figure out that of the people in our sample, about 10,000 were referred to merit, and the remainder, about 300,000 people, were eligible but not referred to merit. And we link this to quite a number of health data sets. So specifically, we have hospital admissions, we have emergency department data, we have data from the New South Wales Ambulance, we have data from the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages about death and what the cause of death was. And we also have these two data sets that pertain to drug treatment. So which we can use both to think about history of drug treatment, but also like drug treatment while on the program. And so these are the minimum data set for drug and alcohol treatment, which captures all publicly funded episodes of drug and alcohol treatment in New South Wales, and also the controlled drugs data collection, which looks at whether someone was dispensed with opioid substitution therapy. So for example, buprenorphine or methadone. Turning to how we actually estimated the benefits, I guess if we were to think about how we arrive at what the dollar value of any improvements that we observe in participant outcomes from merit, there's really two steps. First, we need to determine the impact of merit on criminal justice, health, and mortality outcomes, which is that kind of outcome component that Jackie was alluding to earlier. And then secondly, we need to figure out what the monetary value of these benefits might be. So I'll talk about these in sequence. First, in terms of thinking about the impact of merit, we use a matching approach. What we did is we took the people referred to merit and we compared them to other offenders on both health and justice variables. So this is a very, very terrible chart. It's very vague and messy. All you really need to know is these are all the different, these are a lot of the variables that we have in our data set. In the gray dots, those are the differences between those referred to merit and not referred to merit on each of those characteristics. In purple are the differences between the groups after we've matched. And in the dotted lines are, I guess, what people consider to be acceptable differences between the groups. And so what you really need to know is that, number one, we had a lot of variables. We had demographic variables, we had variables about criminal history, we had variables about people's health history, and specifically their alcohol and drug history of contact with the health system. And then what else you need to know is that our matching strategy did really close these differences between the groups. So the groups that we do compare outcomes on are very, very similar. But I think it's also worthwhile noting that, to be honest, a lot of the differences between those who were referred to merit and not referred to merit in our sample were actually on the criminal justice stuff. So it could be an indication that our health variables, even the alcohol and drug specific ones, are not really, really identifying those kind of merit people or distinguishing those merit people referred to merit, which could indicate like a limitation of our data. And then in terms of costing these benefits, for offending, for victim cost, we rely on this study from the Australian Institute of Criminology that was published in 2011 of victim costs. It estimates the tangible and intangible cost to victims of different types of crimes. So we used the estimates from this escalated to $2019 and also considered the kind of reoffenses that are typically committed by people in merit. And we also just use standard assumptions that we use in DCJ about the costs of court time, police time, and community corrections in valuing offending. In terms of custody, we use the estimates published in the report in government services about how much it costs to have someone in custody for a day, which is about $200. And in terms of mortality, we use this publication from the Office of Best Practice Regulation in Prime Minister's Cabinet, which estimates that the value of statistical life is about $4.9 million on average. For our health analysis, we can for health data, we can apply costing at a more precise level. So we can actually cost every episode of healthcare for everyone in our sample. So for ambulance, we can just use published estimates of the cost of an ambulance call out. And we also have the distance of each ambulance trip. So we can use the kilometer rates to determine how much each ambulance trip costs. For hospital admissions and emergency department costs, we can use the estimates from the Independent Health and Care Pricing Authority, and they publish a national efficient price, which is basically the cost of 1 unit of healthcare. And then in addition to this, for emergency department, presentations and hospital admissions, what we can do is find out weights, which tell us whether a particular contact was more intensive or less. And so, for example, something that's more costly would have a higher weight, like a weight of 4 or 5, and we would multiply this by the national efficient price to find out how much the cost of that episode of healthcare was. So what do we find? We find in terms of reoffenses, so here's a chart. What it's comparing is in the first year after referral, in the second year after referral, what's the difference in the number of reoffenses between, in gray, our matched comparison group, in purple, are the matched group from merit. And what we find is in the first year after referral, those referred to merit commit 0.3 fewer reoffenses on average. And this translates to savings in victim costs, police costs, and court costs of about $2,650 per person. Then we can also look at the reductions in days in custody. So over the first and second year, here we find that those referred to merit, so in purple, on average, they spend about 18 fewer days in custody in that first year after referral, and about 4 days fewer in custody in that second year after referral. What that translates to in terms of savings is about $4,335 in terms of prison costs. In terms of healthcare, we found actually that those referred to merit incurred slightly more, but only marginally in terms of health costs. So on average, in terms of ambulance costs in the first year, there was about $25 more in ambulance costs. And in terms of emergency department presentations, again, just like about $85 more in ED costs. So that's quite minor if you consider the findings from the previous slide that more people in merit are actually out in the community, they spend less time in custody. So the increase in health contact is, at least in terms of these two variables, is minimal. We didn't find any significant differences in either hospital admissions, although the merit group is lower, sorry. Nor in the probability of death. So we don't really consider that moving forward. Now, I guess so far we've seen that that merit does reduce criminal justice. Well, it does reduce reoffending and it also reduces custody. So there are quite significant benefits associated with those reductions. But I guess the next question is whether those benefits are sufficient to outweigh the costs of delivering the program. So turning to that, and returning to the graphic I showed earlier about the additional elements of merit in comparison to a typical local court pathway, I guess you've got two sources of costs. First is that the merit teams are firstly engaging in a screening of the people who are referred to the program, and they're also most of the time delivering a lot of that 12 weeks of treatment. So we need to figure out how much those merit teams cost. But there's also some court time involved in deferring the matter and also checking in. So that also needs to be taken into consideration in thinking about the cost of the program. And as I mentioned earlier, that treatment also does include some outpatient services. So that's another thing that we need to consider in thinking about how much merit costs. So in terms of the cost of the merit team and and even the policy teams and any admin costs, we obtained data from New South Wales Health and also DCJ on the number of people employed in merit teams statewide over the period that we examined. So on average, it's about 15 managers, 78 clinicians, about 14 administrative staff and 1 policy staff. If we think about FTEs, and when we add that all up and divide it by the number of people that go through merit, what we find is that per referral, it costs about $3,800, the cost of these stuff and the administrative costs. Now, turning to the outpatient treatment that people incur while going through this program, we can get estimates of how much each of the types of outpatient treatment costs, because there's this study that was conducted by the Center for International Economics on behalf of New South Wales Health, and it surveyed NGOs who deliver drug and alcohol treatment services around the state to find out how much it costs on average to deliver these services. So this study estimates that the cost of residential rehabilitation in 2019 was about $293 per bed day. And the cost of a withdrawal management episode of treatment is about $11,153. Using the data that we have in the minimum data set for drug and alcohol treatment, we can calculate on average how many bed days and how many episodes of withdrawal management the average person referred to merit incurs. We can multiply this by these estimates, and we kind of obtain an average cost per referral of about $1,548. So as I mentioned earlier, merit can also incurs a bit of additional court time because someone's referred when they might otherwise have had their matter finalized. And then there's also an additional mention in terms of a 6-week check-in. So we just apply some standard assumptions that we make about the cost of a mention, and we find that it's about $677 in terms of in additional court time from merit. So to recap, if just in case you weren't keeping track of all those numbers in your head, the cost of merit is about $6,000 per referral on average, where most of the costs are from the merit teams and the staffing costs, about $3,800. Outpatient treatments, the second largest component of the cost, $1,500, and about $600 in other additional court costs. All right, so if we put this all together and apply sort of the forward discounting that Treasury asks us to do, what we find is that the cost of merit is about $6,300, and the benefits, though, are about $7,200. And what that translates to is there's an 8 for each person referred to merit. There's the benefits exceed the costs by about $800, or well, closer to $900 really. And the benefit cost ratio is 1.14. In other words, for every dollar that's invested into merit, you get about $1.14 in returns. And I'd like to note again that the benefits of merit derive almost entirely, well, pretty much entirely from criminal justice benefits. And I'll talk about this robustness in the next 2 slides. So we used a bunch of sensitivity testing to just look at different assumptions, because we made us, firstly, in our main set of analyses, we included intangible victim costs. So we tried excluding them. In our main analysis, when we think about court time, we also consider the cost of other agencies that are not in DCJ, like the ODPP, legal aid. So what happens when we remove those assumptions, and those costs we consider both in terms of it's on the reoffending side, the benefits of reoffending, as well as the cost of merit. So it's not clear what the impact of that would be before we did this analysis, at least. And then we also, in our main analysis, we just considered the additional cost of outpatient treatments for those in merit versus what would otherwise have been incurred by the people who weren't referred to merit. So we did also take the averages of what treatment they were going through. And basically, long story short is when we try different combinations of changing our assumptions, in the very worst case, we're about a break even. And in most of our scenarios, merit is still delivering a benefit over its cost. The other form of testing we can do is, if you think about what we did, we kind of came up with a bunch of estimates of the data, right? Comparing reoffenses, reductions in days in custody. So if you think about any like statistical variation, are our results actually vulnerable to these kinds of errors from the fact that we just estimated things, and these things typically have errors? What we can do is that we can take those estimates and how variable they are. We can draw many different values for those things and recalculate our cost benefit analysis. And what we find is that almost 93% of the time, the benefit cost ratio and the net present value are positive. Okay, so now finally, I'll just conclude and talk through a few of the implications, at least that we think arise from this study. So to summarize, our objective in this study was to estimate whether merit's benefits in terms of the criminal justice, health service usage, and mortality outweigh its costs. We find that the program delivers approximately $7,200 in benefits, and the program costs about $6,300 per referral. And that translates to, for every dollar spent in the program, a return of $1.14. At this point, I want to note that our results do have 2 major limitations. Even though we tried to overcome some of the weaknesses of previous studies by incorporating more health data, I think it's still quite likely that we haven't really achieved the point of causality. And I think it's because it does seem like the health data that we got doesn't seem to fully identify drug usage. So there's definitely still a possibility that we were comparing people referred to merit who do have a drug problem to people who are not on merit who are not in merit who actually don't have any drug problems. In many of those health variables, even people in merit didn't have any history of alcohol and drug-related health contact. So it's definitely still a possibility. So these could be under or overestimating the benefits. I think as one of our reviewers pointed out, really the variables that we have about health are about contact with health services rather than, more holistic measures of health. And it's very different to end up in the hospital for an overdose as opposed to just, experiencing general health improvements or well-being benefits from not, using drugs. And so it's worthwhile thinking how else we might be able to measure the benefits from reduced drug usage, or really even measuring reduced drug usage, which we don't in this study, and we don't have that. So we've definitely not counted and captured all the plausible benefits that might arise from a program like Merit. Thinking about what this might mean for policy more generally and the implications of our study, it helps show that even less intensive drug diversion can be worthwhile and can, if you think economically at least. But as you can see, most of our benefits in terms of offending only last the year after referrals. So it's possible that more could be done to support longer-term reductions in drug use and more lasting benefits. As I mentioned earlier, there's quite significant attrition from the point of referral to even commencing the program, and there's further attrition from starting the program to completing the program. So reducing this attrition and kind of boosting the completion rate could be another way to amplify these impacts. And so the study that Jackie mentioned earlier that NDARC is doing into participation and completion could be really helpful in informing that work. But I think there's also probably more work that we need to do to understand the possible health benefits of drug treatment, particularly in terms of actual impacts on drug usage. That would be really helpful for, a better cost-benefit analysis maybe in the future. So thank you very much.